I've heard it said that in AA, it doesn't say in the steps, put down the drink, but clearly you can't get sober without putting down the drink. I've also heard it said in ACA, it doesn't say in the steps, build healthy boundaries, but you cannot have emotional sobriety in ACA without building healthy boundaries, which, by the way, is something like reason number 7,562 of why I became a boundaries coach. Boundaries are essential for emotional sobriety, and I think that is the foundation of healthy living. The reason that we eat and drink and drug and gamble and sex and debt and all that stuff is because we're trying to numb ourselves because we're emotionally intoxicated. Hi, I'm Barb Nangle. I want to welcome you to my podcast, Fragmented to Whole: Life Lessons from 12-Step Recovery, where I help people heal their emotional, psychological, and spiritual wounds and make deep, lasting changes in their lives. I'm a boundaries coach who specializes in helping women who say yes when they really want to say no, and who neglect themselves because they're so focused on others. I've coached hundreds of people to create boundaries by design, a blueprint for life. I have a free boundary building starter kit at boundariesstarterkit.com. On this podcast, I share my experience, strength, and hope from recovery. I don't support or endorse any particular 12-step recovery fellowship, and I don't claim to speak for any 12-step fellowship. I don't believe that 12-step recovery is the only way to recover. You might need additional help. I'm an avid beachcomber and a formerly closeted fan of the Hallmark Channel, especially the Christmas movies. I wear fingerless gloves almost all year round because my hands are always cold, and I love taking pictures of license plates with my initials BN on them. My hope is that you'll find my words concretely helpful in improving your life, whether you're in recovery or not. If you like what you've heard on this episode, please screenshot it and share it on your social media. Be sure to tag me at Higher Power Coaching. This is episode 293, How Building Boundaries Helps You Achieve Emotional Sobriety. You may be wondering, what the fuck is emotional sobriety? Well, most people know that in Alcoholics Anonymous, the goal of the program is sobriety, but they don't know that the goal of the ACA program, which I'm a member of, that's Adult Children of Alcoholics and Dysfunctional Families, is emotional sobriety. Now, that term was chosen very specifically and very carefully based on something that Bill W. wrote in The Grapevine in 1958. If you don't know, he is the co-founder of the AA program. And I think it's important to talk about this on this podcast, especially given how much I've shared about my ACA recovery in the last couple of years. Unlike most episodes, I'm going to read some literature, which I will link in the show notes for you in case you'd like to get your hands on them yourself. Of course, I'll share a bit of my own opinion on some of it. The first thing I'll say is that I think there's a difference between you losing your emotional sobriety in a very specific situation and losing it long term. Being a reactive person in a particular scenario is a momentary loss of emotional sobriety, but it's not like a relapse into your old ways where you're acting out repeatedly in your addictions, compulsions, obsessions, being dishonest and manipulative, etc. So if you had a fight with your spouse and you screamed and yelled at them over the weekend, perhaps that's a momentary loss of emotional sobriety, but it doesn't mean that you've lost your emotional sobriety entirely. And I say this because I have been going through a lot of emotional turmoil, especially this year. A lot of it is because of the reparenting and interfamily work I've done, which has been a lot. Now, I know I share quite a bit about that on this episode, on the podcast, but there's so much more that goes on that I don't share, and it's been heavy. I am reorganizing my understanding of myself and my family relationships. Last week's episode about my dad is a perfect example. I am still integrating the understanding that I actually did love my dad. Now, that is a lot to rearrange after 61 years of life. The things that have come up for me have also been financial, and combined with the inner family work, we're talking about some really foundational shit here. I have a lot of limiting beliefs around my finances, and they're coming up now because I work entirely for myself, which is something I've never done before. I have always had the stability of a paycheck from somewhere, even if it was just a part-time paycheck, and I don't have that anymore, so this stuff comes up. I have had hours at a time of not being emotionally sober, sometimes multiple times in a day, but I still feel like I'm an emotionally sober person. So I just want to say that just because you lose your emotional sobriety from time to time, it doesn't mean you've lost it in total. All right, on to the literature that I'm going to read from. The first one is a small book called Emotional Sobriety: The Next Frontier. This is a book published by the AA Grapevine, and it's got selected stories from the AA Grapevine. The one I'm reading from is the first version. There's also a second version. I have that one as well, but I'm not reading from that. I'm also going to read an excerpt from the ACA Yellow 12-Step Workbook. It has one of the best and most precise definitions of emotional sobriety, at least in my opinion. And then I'm also going to read from the book 12 Essential Insights for Emotional Sobriety: Getting Your Recovery Unstuck by Alan Berger. That is a fantastic book. I just read it last year with my sponsor, and we both loved it and got a ton out of it. I actually highly recommend all of these pieces of literature, and again, I link them in the show notes. So I'm starting with the Grapevine piece because these are the words of Bill W., the founder of AA, so people can see that the roots of the ACA Fellowship come from these words from Bill W. So this was published in the Grapevine in January of 1958, and it's called The Next Frontier: Emotional Sobriety. And this is entirely quoted. I think that many oldsters would have to put our AA booze cure to severe but successful tests, still find they often lack emotional sobriety. Perhaps they will be the spearhead for the next major development in AA, the development of much more real maturity and balance, which is to say, humility, in our relations with ourselves, with our fellows, and with God. Those adolescent urges that so many of us have for top approval, perfect security, and perfect romance, urges quite appropriate to age 17, prove to be an impossible way of life when we are at age 47 or 57. Since AA began, I've taken immense wallops in all these areas because of my failure to grow up emotionally and spiritually. My God, how painful it is to keep demanding the impossible, and how very painful to discover finally that all along we have had the cart before the horse. Then comes the final agony of seeing how awfully wrong we have been, but still finding ourselves unable to get off the emotional merry-go-round. How to translate a right mental conviction into a right emotional result, and so into easy, happy, and good living? Well, that's not only the neurotic's problem, it's the problem of life itself for all of us who have got to the point of real willingness to hew to right principles in all our affairs. Even then, as we hew away, peace and joy may still elude us. That's the place so many of us AA oldsters have come to, and it's a hell of a spot, literally. How shall our unconscious, from which so many of our fears, compulsions, and phony aspirations still stream, be brought into line with what we actually believe, know, and want? How to convince our dumb, raging, and hidden Mr. Hyde becomes our main task. I've recently come to believe that this can be achieved. I believe so because I begin to see many benighted ones, folks like you and me, commencing to get results. Last autumn, depression, having no really rational cause at all, almost took me to the cleaners. I began to be scared that I was in for another long chronic spell. Considering the grief I've had with depression, it wasn't a bright prospect. I kept asking myself, why can't the 12 steps work to release depression? By the hour, I stared at the St. Francis prayer. It's better to comfort than to be comforted. Here was the formula, all right, but why didn't it work? Suddenly, I realized what the matter was. My basic flaw had always been dependence, almost absolute dependence on people or circumstances to supply me with prestige, security, and the like. Failing to get these things according to my perfectionistic dreams and specifications, I had fought for them. And when defeat came, so did my depression. There wasn't a chance of making the outgoing love of St. Francis a workable and joyous way of life until these fatal and almost absolute dependencies were cut away. Because I had over the years undergone a little spiritual development, the absolute quality of these frightful dependencies had never before been so starkly revealed. Reinforced by what grace I could secure in prayer, I found I had to exert every ounce of will and action to cut off these faulty emotional dependencies upon people, upon AA, indeed upon any set of circumstances whatsoever. Then only could I be free to love as St. Francis had. Emotional and instinctual satisfactions I saw were really the extra dividends of having love, offering love, and expressing a love appropriate to each relation of life. Plainly, I could not avail myself of God's love until I was able to offer it back to Him by loving others as He would love me. And I couldn't possibly do that as long as I was victimized by false dependencies. For my dependency meant demand, a demand for the possession and control of the people and the conditions surrounding me. While those words, absolute dependency, may look like a gimmick, they are the ones that helped to trigger my release into my present degree of stability and quietness of mind, qualities which I am now trying to consolidate by offering love to others, regardless of the return to me. This seems to be the primary healing circuit, an outgoing love of God's creation and His people, by means of which we avail ourselves of His love for us. It is most clear that the real current can't flow until our paralyzing dependencies are broken and broken at depth. Only then can we possibly have a glimmer of what adult love really is. Spiritual calculus, you say? Not a bit of it. Watch any AA of 6 months working with a new 12th step case. If the case says, "to the devil with you," the 12th stepper only smiles and turns to another case. He doesn't feel frustrated or rejected. If his next case responds and in turn starts to give love and attention to other alcoholics, yet gives none back to him, the sponsor is happy about it anyway. He still doesn't feel rejected. Instead, he rejoices that his one-time prospect is sober and happy. And if his next following case turns out in later time to be his best friend or romance, then the sponsor is most joyful. But he well knows that his happiness is a byproduct, the dividend of giving without any demand for a return. The really stabilizing thing for him was having and offering love to that strange drunk on his doorstep. That was Francis at work, powerful and practical, minus dependency and minus demand. In the first 6 months of my own sobriety, I worked hard with many alcoholics, and not a one responded. Yet this work kept me sober. It wasn't a question of those alcoholics giving me anything. My stability came out of trying to give, not out of demanding that I receive. Thus, I think it can work out with emotional sobriety. If we examine every disturbance we have, great or small, we will find at the root of it some unhealthy dependency and its consequent unhealthy demand. Let us, with God's help, continually surrender these hobbling demands. Then we can be set free to live and love. We may then be able to 12th step ourselves and others into emotional sobriety. Of course, I haven't offered you a really new idea, only a gimmick that has started to unhook several of my own hexes at depth. Nowadays, my brain no longer races compulsively in either elation, grandiosity, or depression. I have been given a quiet place in bright sunshine, and that is signed by Bill W. Next, I'm going to read an excerpt from the ACA Yellow 12-Step Workbook. This section is called What Does Recovery Look Like? It's from one of the early pages in the workbook. In fact, it's the last page before page 1 in that book. So it says, by working the 12 steps of the ACA program and by attending meetings regularly, we begin to realize that ACA recovery involves emotional sobriety. It says, this is what recovery looks like. Sorry about that. But what is emotional sobriety? To understand emotional sobriety, one must first understand emotional intoxication, which is also known as para-alcoholism. Para-alcoholism represents the mannerisms and behaviors we developed by living with an alcoholic or dysfunctional parent. As children, we took on the fear and denial of the alcoholic or non-drinking parent without taking a drink. Emotional intoxication can be characterized by obsession and unhealthy dependence. There also can be compulsion even without drugs and alcohol. We can be, quote, drunk on fear, excitement, or pain. We can also be drunk on arguing, gossip, or self-imposed isolation. In essence, the laundry list, or the 14 traits of an adult child, offers a textbook example of the behaviors and attitudes that characterize an emotionally intoxicated person. We fear authority figures and judge ourselves harshly while being terrified of abandonment. Without help, we seek out others to reenact our family dynamics. We can recreate our family dysfunction at home or on the job indefinitely until we find ACA. This means that our adult relationships resemble the template relationships we developed as children to survive an alcoholic or otherwise dysfunctional home. We find others to create chaos, conflict, or unsafe relationships. That's the end of that part. That definition so far has really been about the opposite of emotional sobriety, which is called emotional intoxication. This next paragraph is the actual definition of emotional sobriety. Quote, emotional sobriety involves a changed relationship with self and others. We measure emotional sobriety by the level of honesty, mutual respect, and the acceptability of feelings in our relationships. If our relationships are still manipulative, controlling, we are not emotionally sober no matter what we tell ourselves about our recovery program. Emotional sobriety means that we are involved in changed relationships that are safe and honest. We feel a nearness to our higher power. We cultivate emotional sobriety through the 12 steps and through association with recovering adult children. End quote. Now, I wrote a couple of notes on that page, one of which says, don't settle for anything less than this. And it has an arrow pointing to that last paragraph with the definition of emotional sobriety, which I drew a box around. And then I also wrote a note that says, when we have secure boundaries, we don't need to manipulate or control because we meet our own needs. Now, I have done the ACA 12 steps 4 times. My guess is I wrote that last comment either time 3 or 4, because I definitely did not understand that in the beginning. Now, I've heard it said that in AA, it doesn't say in the steps, put down the drink, but clearly you can't get sober without putting down the drink. I've also heard it said in ACA, it doesn't say in the steps, build healthy boundaries, but you cannot have emotional sobriety in ACA without building healthy boundaries, which, by the way, is something like reason number 7,562 of why I became a boundaries coach. Boundaries are essential for emotional sobriety, and I think that is the foundation of healthy living. The reason that we eat and drink and drug and gamble and sex and debt and all that stuff is because we're trying to numb ourselves because we're emotionally intoxicated. All right. Now I want to move on to Berger's book about the 12 essential insights about emotional sobriety. He says emotional sobriety is a mental state where you don't react to your changing emotions as though they were the governing facts of your life. Emotional sobriety emerges as we gain freedom from our emotional storms. This mental state is cultivated as a continual practice. You don't arrive and stay there. Now, that comports with what I said earlier about how we may have ebbs and flows in our emotional sobriety in day-to-day life, but it doesn't necessarily mean you've lost your emotional sobriety entirely. I may have lost it momentarily, but it doesn't mean my life is emotionally unstable in its entirety. He goes on to say emotional sobriety doesn't come from stopping our emotions, which is impossible. It emerges as we pay attention to what our emotions are telling us. We don't give feelings a privileged space. We don't thoughtlessly react to them. And he gives lots of specific examples from clients in his book. So I highly recommend you read it if you're like, what the fuck does this mean? So he says we give our feelings appropriate respect. And he says some of the characteristics of emotional sobriety are 1, centeredness. This is the ability to stay centered in yourself, regardless of circumstances. So we're not shaming, blaming, victimizing, manipulating other people. 2, it also includes emotional independence or autonomy. What he says about that is that it's the lack of emotional dependence and capacity to support yourself emotionally. In other words, emotional support of others is not required. You don't give away your balance to the whims of the world, to the words of others, or their emotional states. And third, he says it also involves emotional maturity, which means you have a firm but flexible inner sense of self. Your emotional balance comes from your sense of self-awareness. You know who you are. The way I would say that is you know the boundaries of you. Berger also talks about having an emotional center of gravity, and that when we're emotionally intoxicated, we get knocked off of our emotional center of gravity. That means our emotions pull us in one direction or the other. In my opinion, healthy boundaries are what keep us from getting knocked off of balance and keep us centered, because when we have healthy boundaries, we know who we are, we know where we end and other people begin. You know what's okay with you and not okay with you, and you're focused internally rather than externally on people, places, and things. One of the ways I've been thinking about it lately is I am situated in me, in my body, and in my life, whereas I used to be situated in various other people. So if your goal is to get to emotional sobriety, working on your emotions is imperative and working on your boundaries is essential. And guess who can help you with that? I help professional women set boundaries with calm confidence so they avoid burnout and resentment and build healthy, balanced personal and professional relationships. If that's you, this is the perfect time to work with me because I'm doing a massive Black Friday special from Monday, November 25th through Cyber Monday, December 2nd. You'll get $1,000 off my 12-week private coaching program with this special. That's more than 25% off. And the price of this program is only going to get higher in the future. To take advantage of this special, you have to sign up for a call with me this week. Go to barbchat.net to sign up for your call. That's barbchat.net. I put extra time slots on my calendar for the week, so get on there this week to get you set up for the December holidays and start 2025 with those balanced personal and professional relationships you've always longed for. If you like this podcast, and I'm guessing you did because you're still listening, you will also love my weekly newsletter, Friday Fragments, which has short essays similar to the podcast. You can check it out at fridayfragments.news. That's fridayfragments.news. If you haven't already subscribed to my podcast on your favorite podcast outlet, please do that. It helps carry the message to more people. I started this podcast because there was so much wisdom in recovery that just wasn't making its way out into the world. So I want as many people as possible to hear it. I'd also love it if you'd leave a 5-star rating or a review, which you can do on Apple Podcasts. It helps other people find it so they can get the benefits that you've gotten from listening. If someone in particular came to mind when you listen to this episode, please share it with them. And my favorite place to hang out on social media is Instagram. I'm at Higher Power Coaching. Please DM me there. I'd love to hear what you got from this episode. I run private and group coaching programs on building healthy boundaries. Whether you need help with boundaries in your personal, professional, or romantic life, I can help. Head on over to barbchat.net where you can get on my calendar for a free 30-minute Better Boundaries consultation. I also do short-term situational coaching to help people make it through specific situations they're going through, such as divorce, empty nesting, preparing for retirement, or any phase where their identity is shifting. Regardless of the type of coaching, my ideal client is someone who is ripe for change. If that's you, I'd love to work with you. My goal with all my work is to help you make lasting changes in your life, like I've made deep, lasting changes in my life. Remember, it's never too late to recover. No one is beyond hope, and healing is possible. Thanks for listening.